What if I told you that Emu isn't the final villain of One Piece?
I beg your pardon?
What if the true final villain was actually in our faces the entire time? And the villain I'm talking about is Marshall D. Teach, also known as Blackbeard. Despite Blackbeard being introduced very early in the series, going all the way back to the Jaya arc to this day, Blackbeard as a villain is still very present in the series. No other villain has been built up as much as Blackbeard has, always operating in the shadows and has only had a few encounters with our main protagonist. I know it seems that Emu is going to become the final villain because he is the creator of the world government and he currently reigns supreme over everything. But I think from the way Blackbeard was introduced and his whole dynamic with Luffy, with them both aiming for the same goal, Blackbeard seemed to be the final obstacle in Luffy's journey. So this video is going to be a deep dive analysis into the character of Blackbeard and why he is actually the true final villain of One Piece. So there are a number of reasons to why Blackbeard is going to be the final villain of the series. So I'm first going to start off with the way Blackbeard was introduced to the series. When we are first introduced to Blackbeard, Oda decided to make sure his introduction was unique, unlike any other villain introductions he wrote. When looking at other villains in their introductions, they were seen as very menacing and massive threats to let the readers know how dangerous these characters are. When we first see Arlong, he was hyped up by Yosaku to be very dangerous, and when Nami looked at his wanted poster, she decided to leave the crew. And we even see a kid trying to take revenge on Arlong for murdering his father before Nami stopped him. So in the first chapter of Arlong's introduction, he was viewed as very cruel and very evil. With Crocodile, even though he was fully introduced in Alabasta, he had a lot of mystery to him before that, because he was operating under the alias of Mr. Zero, the leader of Baroque Works. And we saw how dangerous that organization was, as seen on Whiskey Peak and Little Garden. So these arcs were hyping up Crocodile to be someone to be taken serious. With Enel, his first introduction was him obliterating a trespasser who stepped on the Verf land with one of his lightning attacks, and he was viewed as a god before we were introduced to him. When Doflamingo was first introduced, he was already causing trouble at the Warlords meeting, and we see that his former bounty was 340 million berries, which was extremely high at that point in the story. We see more of his ruthlessness as well when he punished Bellamy at the end of Skypiea. Then in Punk Hazard, it was revealed by Law that he was actually Joker, and we see that he was making the citizens in Dressrosa suffer for years, letting the readers know just how evil he really is. With Kaido, he was first seen jumping down from the Sky Islands and surviving the fall trying to end his life, but he still survived. The narrator hypes him up as the world's strongest creature, and that if you were to fight him one-on-one, you always bet on Kaido. So this was telling the reader just how strong and how much of a threat Kaido was when we first see him. And then with Emu, he was first shown in the Reverie, and Emu had so much mystery because Emu was the only character who was allowed to sit on the empty throne. Not even the 5 elders were given that privilege. So again, this was all to hype up Emu as someone who stands at the very top of the world. But with Blackbeard, we first see him in a comedic scene with Luffy at the bar. Even though Luffy heard about Blackbeard from Ace in Alabasta, he didn't know what he actually looked like, so he never recognized him as Blackbeard when they first met. And the same applies to Blackbeard. He didn't hear about Luffy before meeting him, and it was only until he found out that his bounty was 100 million berries when Blackbeard finally wanted to go after him. But when you look at the other villains, when Luffy first meets them, he always sees them as a threat and an enemy he needs to take down. But when Luffy first meets Blackbeard, he had no reason to fight him on a serious note, making his encounter with Blackbeard very unique compared to how Luffy encounters other villains in the story. You would expect a major villain to have such a grand introduction, but Oda decided to make it comedic and just a random encounter between them at the bar. And Blackbeard wasn't even that famous at the time as well. He didn't really make a name for himself until way later on, similar to how Luffy was at that point in the story. Even though we heard about Blackbeard attacking Drum Island and killing his former crewmate, he still wasn't a huge name, nor was he someone that the world government needed to deal with immediately. Because when Lafitte recommended they recruit him as a warlord, the Marines said that they'd never heard of him and were hesitant in recruiting him because he was a nobody. Even Lafitte was more famous than Blackbeard at that time, because Suru, one of the Vice Admirals, recognized him. So Blackbeard was introduced as a nobody with a very unique encounter with the main protagonist, so Oda clearly had something in store for him, unlike any other antagonist in the series. Another reason why Blackbeard will become the true final villain is the fact that he is the complete opposite of Luffy. Because Blackbeard is the complete opposite of the main character, it makes Blackbeard a foil character. And a foil character is a character in fiction that contrasts with another character, typically the main protagonist. This is important because since Blackbeard is the foil to Luffy, it makes Blackbeard as important to the story as Luffy is, and it also means that eventually their ideologies and their beliefs are going to clash once they have their fight. Just by looking at their first time meeting with each other, it was a comedic scene where one would complain about the food, but the other would say that the food tasted really good. They both share the same love for eating, but they have completely opposite tastes. It's a funny scene, but this is also Oda letting us know from the jump how Luffy and Blackbeard are two sides of the same coin. And there are other villains in the series that were written to be the opposite of Luffy, like Emu for example, who represents oppression and dominance, and Luffy representing freedom and Joy Boy, making them both opposites. But it's more different with Blackbeard, because Blackbeard is a pirate just like Luffy, with the same goal of becoming the next pirate king, and they both are trying to achieve that goal using completely opposite methods. When Bellamy was ridiculing Luffy, Zoro and Nami for talking about the Sky Island, he was claiming that the era of dreams is over. So everyone in the town was mocking them for having such dreams. But Blackbeard was the only one who actually agreed with Luffy in that the era of dreams is not over. No other villain that was introduced ever agreed with Luffy on anything. But Blackbeard was the first and only one who actually stuck up for Luffy, and he hoped that he would actually find the Sky Island to prove everyone wrong. So Luffy and Blackbeard are two pirates with the same belief in how dreams will never end, and it's because they have that same mindset that they were both able to become the next emperors of the sea. Another thing that they both share is how they both carried the Will of D in their names. It's still unknown on what exactly the Will of D is, but we do know that those with the Will of D were once enemies of the world government during the Void Century. Blackbeard was the son of Rocksteady Zebek, who was part of the Davy family, and the Davy family are the descendants of Davy D. Jones, who lived during the Void Century, and because he carried the Will of D, he was also the enemy of the 20 Kingdoms who would later form the world government. We still don't have all the details of the Void Century, but from the conversation between Emu and Zebek, Joy Boy and Davy Jones both seem to be his greatest enemies back then. This is very interesting because Luffy is very connected with Joy Boy, in that he has the same devil fruit as him. He was mistaken for Joy Boy by Zunisha and Emmet, and Luffy also shares the same love for freedom and adventure like Joy Boy did. And Blackbeard has a connection with Davy D. Jones, because they are both from the same family. Davy Jones was also said to have been the king of the world by Zebek, which is exactly what Blackbeard wants to achieve, to become king of the world. And Davy Jones used to take things from other pirates from a Davy back, which is similar to how Blackbeard will take away the devil fruit from other pirates to increase the strength of his crew. No other major villain in the series has a D in their name. In fact, Blackbeard is the only character from the D clan that we know so far who is a major villain. All other characters in the series with the Will of D were on the same side as Luffy, besides Garp and Dragon, but those two aren't villains. Dragon also hates the world government, and Garp has expressed his disgust towards the celestial dragons. So the fact that Blackbeard is the only villain in the entire series with the Will of D shows just how important the rivalry between Luffy and Blackbeard really is, and it shows the deeper connection between them more than any other villain. But let's look into more detail in how they both operate differently to achieve their goals. In Luffy's view, he sees the king of the pirates as the freest man on the sea, someone who has achieved the ultimate freedom in doing what they want without being oppressed or being controlled by anyone. But with Blackbeard, his view of the pirate king is completely different. Blackbeard views the pirate king as someone who has everything, which includes fame, money, power, and status. Blackbeard wants to become the pirate king so he can conquer and dominate the seas with his power. So his ambition comes from greed and always wanting to take everything for himself by reaching the top, which is a more traditional pirate's way of doing things. When you look at Goldie Roger's execution in the first chapter of the series, the narrator describes Roger as someone who achieved wealth, fame and power. But on top of achieving those things, Roger was also the freest man on the sea. He was very adventurous and enjoyed visiting islands and exploring the world. So Luffy's and Blackbeard's ambitions both reflect the very things that Roger achieved once he became the Pirate King, his fame and power, and his freedom. And then when you look at how the both of them formed their crews, Luffy and Blackbeard recruit their members on completely different conditions. Luffy doesn't ask people to join his crew solely because of their strength. He recruits those who are essential in a normal pirate crew, and just good people in general. When he first meets Zoro, Zoro was already seen as a bad person, but Luffy saw that he was actually a good person deep down, and he wanted to ask him to join his crew, after Helmeppo said he was going to execute him. When Luffy sees Sanji and Baratie feeding Gin when no one else wanted to prepare food for him, Luffy saw just how kind Sanji was as a person, and he decided that he was going to be the cook for his crew. He wanted Nami to join as well because he was looking for a navigator, and he also saw that she was a good person deep down, even when she tried to betray him numerous times. For the longest time, Luffy was also searching for a musician, because the traditional pirate crew always has musicians. He didn't care whether the musician was particularly strong, because that is not what Luffy is searching for when forming his crew. He also recruits members who he deems to be very interesting, because when he first meets Brook, he found it funny that he was just a talking skeleton with an afro, and he immediately asked him to join his crew. He didn't care why or how he became a talking skeleton in the first place. He just found him interesting, so he asked him to join. And that is all part of Luffy's adventurous nature. He loves meeting new people and exploring things he has never seen before. Even later on in Thriller Bark, Luffy encounters a zombie tree and a zombie unicorn having a drink. Then Luffy catches them and immediately asks him to join his crew. Had Zoro and Sanji not been there, those zombies potentially could have joined. So when Luffy asks people to join his crew, he doesn't just look at them for their strength. He would ask them to join him if he sees that they are good people, funny and interesting looking people, or those that have dreams and ambitions of their own. This is the complete opposite when it comes to Blackbeard though. Blackbeard is looking to conquer and dominate the seas, so in order to reach that goal, he needs to form the strongest crew possible. He literally went all the way down to level 6 of Impel Down to recruit the worst criminals from that prison. And he also recruited Shiryu of the Rain, who was the previous jail warden. Luffy only recruits those he sees as good people, but Blackbeard does not mind recruiting the most evil criminals. He knows that by joining up with the most dangerous criminals in the world, he can also power them up by giving them devil fruit abilities to further increase the strength of his crew, bringing him closer to ruling the seas. When looking at the fight between Blackbeard and Ace, after getting Ace to his knees, Blackbeard offers him a chance to join his crew because he knows how strong Ace is, and he thought it would be a waste to kill him right there. Even though he doesn't fully trust Kuzan, Blackbeard still let him join his crew because he knows he can use Kuzan to help achieve his goals, and that's what seems to be occurring with Blackbeard's crew. It is more of a transactional relationship formed out of convenience, whereas Luffy treats his crewmates like family. Blackbeard has no problem replacing any crewmate he would deem to be useless or someone who has served their purpose. We see that he was willing to sacrifice his own crewmates who were petrified by Hancock's powers, by killing Hancock, meaning that his crewmates would remain petrified. That is because Blackbeard does not see his crew as a family, but instead he sees them as tools for him to reach his goals. But Luffy is the direct opposite. Luffy was willing to climb the mountain on Drum Island, with no regard for his own well-being, in hopes that Nami would seek medical attention. And Luffy has also expressed how he treasures his friends more than anything, and he cannot become the king of the pirates without them. And the same applies to the crewmates as well. We have seen the members of the Straw Hats putting their lives on the line to save Luffy, but the same cannot be said for the Blackbeard pirates. They would be ready to leave him if Blackbeard does not fulfill his promise of ruling the seas and giving them fame and power. So Oda is clearly trying to build up both of these crews in opposite ways until their ideals would eventually clash with each other on Raftel, which potentially could be the final arc of the series. We have even more proof of Oda building up both of these crews when we look at how many members each crew has. There are currently 10 members of the Straw Hat Pirates, which is pretty low compared to most other pirate crews we have seen. When you look at the Big Mom Pirates and the Beast Pirates, they both have an enormous amount of crew members, which is fitting for an Emperor of the Sea. Even the Red Haired Pirates have a lot of members on the crew, although it's not as much as Kaido's or Big Mom's. And with the Blackbeard Pirates, you have Blackbeard, and then you have the 10 officers ranked below him, who each have a division that they have command over. But the story mainly focuses on the 10 captains and Blackbeard, making them 11 members important to the story. This is very close to the number of the Straw Hats, which consists of 10 members. So there's definitely a possibility that the Straw Hats will each have a solo fight against each member of the Blackbeard Pirates on Raftel, and the winners will get the One Piece treasure. And you're probably thinking, how can they each have a solo fight if there is one more member on Blackbeard's crew? Well, there are two possibilities to solve this problem. The first possibility is that Kuzan leaves the crew and betrays them at some point during this final saga. Because the Blackbeard Pirates don't seem to trust Kuzan, so it is possible that he will betray them, leaving them with 10 members. And the second possibility is that the Straw Hats will gain their final 11th member during the final saga, making it 11 versus 11 for the final battle. So the final battle in Raftel could involve solo fights between each member having their final battles before the series ends. We could have fights like Zoro vs Shiryu since they're both swordsmen, Chopper vs Doc Q because they're both doctors, and even Usopp vs Van Ogre because they are both snipers. So I think Oda is building these crews to be mirrors of each other, with them both having the same number of members for their final battle for the One Piece treasure. And the last thing I want to talk about regarding Blackbeard becoming the final villain is how well he has been built up. Blackbeard was first mentioned at Drum Island, and at the time he was just a nobody pirate who wasn't seen as a threat to the world government yet. But as the series goes, we hear more about how dangerous and how cunning he can be, when we hear from Ace that he actually killed his own crewmate, in order to take the darkness route. This leads to the fight between Blackbeard and Ace, and although this fight was on a random island, it became the trigger to the war at Marineford. This war at Marineford impacted the entire series moving forward, because of the aftermath and how it tipped the balance of the three major powers of the world. And all of this was part of Blackbeard's plan. He was very conniving, working in the shadows in the background, not bringing too much attention to himself, until he finally kills Whitebeard and gains his devil fruit power. And an interesting thing to take from this is that in terms of the themes of the story, Luffy is supposed to represent the sun, who brings the dawn of a new era, whereas Blackbeard is supposed to represent the darkness, that brings fear and dominion over the seas. This was first mentioned between the fight between Blackbeard and Ace, where Blackbeard mentions who would win between the sun and the darkness. But Ace lost the fight, showing that darkness triumphed over the sun. But it's only going to be a temporary victory, because one of Whitebeard's final speeches was that eventually the sun will rise again and bring the dawn of a new era. This is foreshadowing on the fight between Luffy and Blackbeard, who both represent the very core themes of the series. Blackbeard gained his powers through manipulation and greed, whereas Luffy gained his powers through hard work and training. Another thing to point out is the fact that Blackbeard relies more on devil fruits more than any other villain in the series. Normally, the major villains use the Haki and the devil fruits in combination, but Blackbeard seems to always rely on devil fruits to the point where he would give them to his crewmates, regardless of the risk that comes with eating the fruit. In the fight against Kaido, Kaido talks about how Goldie Roger became the strongest without needing a devil fruit, and he points out how Haki is way more essential in the New World. This is shown with Luffy mastering all forms of Haki, but Blackbeard doesn't even have Conqueror's Haki, despite all the other major villains possessing it. You would think that Blackbeard would have Conqueror's Haki as well, so this was probably done on purpose, because Blackbeard is the only character to possess two devil fruit abilities, but has zero knowledge of Conqueror's Haki. And I think this will come into play once Luffy fights against Blackbeard, and this could be what leads Blackbeard to his defeat by the hands of Luffy. And with them both sharing the same goal, this is something that can only be resolved at the very end of the series. Luffy's goal is to find the One Piece and to become the Pirate King. This was established since the very first chapter of the entire manga. The story about the world government, Joy Boy and the Void Century, all of that came later on down the line, but the actual main premise of the series is Luffy trying to find the treasure and becoming the king of the pirates. That's why I think that once the world government, Emu and the Celestial Dragons have all been taken down, Luffy will still need to reach Raftel, which is the final island of their journey, and Blackbeard and his crew will be there also looking for the treasure, making this the final battle. It's kind of like what happened in Naruto, where after Team 7 took down Kaguya, Naruto still had to defeat Sasuke at the end, making Sasuke the actual final villain of the series, because Naruto's primary goal was to always become Hokage, and his fight with Sasuke was about fighting for that title. So I can see the same thing happening with Luffy and Blackbeard. After taking down the world government, they'll have that final battle on Raftel to see who gets the One Piece. But what do you guys think? Do you think Blackbeard is the true final villain of the series? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.